concept of arousal here. So let's define it first thing as a first process. We're looking at the level of excitement that a performer will experience and their readiness to go about that performance. So it's got something to do with kind of like excitement, agitation, hyping up, psyching up sort of process, that kind of like feeling of energy and sort of frenetic kind of feeling of pre-competitionness and all that kind of stuff. But it also relates to sort of how ready someone is. So readiness is like, I suppose, the opposite of kind of like sleepfulness, you know, where you're drowsy and lethargic. Well, readiness is kind of like activation. So arousal is both excitement and activation or readiness. And the other point we want to make about arousal is it is not only a psychological process. It certainly is a psychological process, how one gears one's mind to the upcoming and challenge of competition and training, for example. But it's also a physiological process in that arousal has a physiological or physical, sometimes we call it somatic, impact on the body. So that can be, for example, an increase in temperature, an increase in heart rate, an increase in breathing depth, for example. We might be more prone to sweating when we're a little bit more aroused, for example. We've got like that physical, agitated, activated sort of persona when our arousal levels go up. Now look, that's very much sort of skirting around some of the very major issues with the arousal. I would really encourage all students to go and read about the reticular activating system and how this actually operates in the brain. It's truly fascinating stuff. But for now, we'll move on and we'll look at one particular theory. And that theory is what we refer to as the inverted, which I'm sure you know just means upside down, the inverted U theory. It was presented by two researchers, Yerkes and Dodson, and it's been given a lot of credence in relation to how it describes the process or the relationship between arousal and performance quality. So let's have a look at what we've got here in our sketched graph. We have, on the x-axis, we have arousal. So obviously, if we go more in that direction, we're talking about arousal being higher. And we've got performance quality on the y-axis. So in this sense, the higher this curve goes, the better the performance is. So I'd first of all encourage you to think what shape this curve would be for you. What is the relationship between arousal and how well you perform, for example? But in general, and what Yerkes and Dodson suggest, and I find this really tricky to sort of hand sketch, they generally suggest that performance quality is in the shape of what I've done, a very wobbly inverted U. Okay, and that is to say that, and I'm going to describe this just underneath for you. That is to say, let's just put it like that. That is to say that as arousal increases, so let's put it like this: as arousal increases, so does performance quality. So does performance quality, and we can see that on the curve, right? So does performance quality. Let me just write that in for you because it's kind of like a key point and you may well need to make that description when you come to do an exam answer here. But as we see here, look, as arousal goes, you know, we're moving this way with arousal. As arousal increases, performance quality increases, doesn't it? We can see performance quality increases, but it kind of increases to sort of like a threshold point. So there's like a threshold point here, and actually let's write that in for us here. And it kind of continues to increase. Let me change my page on my notes. Up to an optimal point. Up to an optimal point of performance. Now, how do we know that this point of performance is optimal? Well, the most important thing that we can say is that if we sort of scan across from this point here, it's the highest level of performance quality that on this illustration that is being produced. So in other words, we reach this threshold point. So even from here to here, look, as arousal level is increasing, look, from here to here, we don't really get an increase in performance quality. It remains stationary. And we call this the optimal point of arousal, the optimal point of arousal. And there's our term, optimal point of arousal, which brings about best performance. But the key thing I'm going to tell you is that we describe the level of arousal according to the inverted U as moderate levels of arousal. So this area here is referred to as moderate levels of arousal, which bring about this zone or this point of optimal functioning. Okay, this area here of optimal performance, okay? So that happens at moderate arousal levels according to this theory. Well, in that case then, what do we call this area here? What can we call this area here? And generally speaking, we can refer to this as under arousal. And as we see from the curve, as arousal continues to increase up in this direction, we actually now have a reduction in performance quality. And that is sort of illustrated in this area over here. And I'm sure you can already tell me that this would be described as over arousal. Over arousal. So we also want to say down here that beyond the optimal point, all increases in arousal, in arousal will cause a decrease in performance. Let's just say will cause down arrow in performance. And we can see that, right? The more height, the more aroused we get, the performance level drops and drops and drops, and we call that over arousal. Okay, so performance quality actually diminishes. All right, a couple of points I want to make before we finish this. Sometimes this yellow area here, we can sometimes refer to it as boredom. Okay, so under arousal is sometimes referred to as boredom, and over arousal is sometimes referred to as panic. Just be aware of those terms because they're useful for you to know. And the middle point, this area here, which we've kind of done in pink, this level of that's meant to be pink, this level of arousal in here, this is what's called the optimal point. Optimal point. So let's make sure that we label that in that way, and it brings about our best level of performance. So if we were to interpret the main findings of Yerkes and Dodson's research and what they've claimed is that the job of the coach, the job of the athlete, is to get the performer to moderate levels of arousal. Moderate levels of arousal. And if that happens, according to this theory as we're looking at it right now, that will mean that for all performers, they perform at their best level. Now, I hope that by you hearing me say that, you already have criticisms of this theory. And my very next recording is going to be all about perhaps some of those criticisms and how we might need to interpret this slightly differently to encompass different activities, different personality types, different levels of skill, and so on and so on. Now, look, in our last recording, we looked in quite a bit of detail at the inverted U theory, and I am going to make an assumption that you've already studied and covered this. So if you haven't had a look at that first arousal tutorial, I strongly recommend you do that. But basically what we said was, and I'll actually just drag it down so we can see the three main sort of talking points. The inverted U theory suggests that as arousal increases, so does performance quality. And we can see that in this area here. As arousal goes up, performance quality likewise, which is obviously here on the y-axis, on the vertical axis, goes up. Until, or up to, an optimal or threshold point, and that, of course, let me just change colour, that threshold point is here, this sort of area here, this area here, this optimal point, and that is achieved at moderate levels of arousal. So basically the inverted U theory says that best performance, or optimal performance, tends to happen at moderate levels of arousal, and that, should we get more aroused than that, then a decrease in performance is likely to occur. So those were the main ideas of our inverted U theory. So if we were to sketch that out again, we would end up with some kind of inverted U with, and excuse my dodgy old hand drawing, but again, with the optimal level of arousal being here at moderate levels of arousal. Okay, so that's basically what our inverted U theory tells us, doesn't it? Okay, now the point we really need to make, and if we apply any sort of thought of it to this model, of course, it's very easy to criticize, because we can say, well, hang on a second, what if people are different? And people are different, of course. What if what they're doing is different? What about their level of learning being different? And of course, those things all make a difference. So what I'm going to do here, and it's very simple really, is I'm going to take two different performances. I'm going to loosely say that this long jump performance being performed by Jess Ennis Hill here is an example of a gross skill. Of course, remember what gross skills are. They're skills based on strength, speed, or endurance, and they involve large muscle groups. So we can say that the long jump, largely has those characteristics, so it's a gross skill. We say with a fine skill, and I'm going to use the basketball, and I think this is a free throw shot here, fine skill, which is based on precision, accuracy, control of movement, smaller muscle groups, So we're saying that this is more of a fine skill, this basketball free throw shot. Now then, neither of them is, the long jump isn't entirely gross and the shot and basketball isn't entirely fine, but they are different in that context. So let's see if we can understand how the inverted U might look differently for each of these skills. Well, a fine skill. Can we argue with the fine skill that people generally perform it better when they are calmer? Does that make intuitive common sense to you? You know, you might see this performer here, before he or she takes shot, I think it's a he, before he takes shot, he might sort of, use that breathing control to calm himself down, to steady the nerves. And on that basis then, we suggest that the inverted U might be a different shape. It might reach its peak earlier, and higher levels of arousal might cause a decrease in performance. Notice now that we have our peak here, which we might describe as low, or certainly lower levels of arousal than we've got from the typical inverted U. And notice, by the way, I tried to make the levels roughly the same. We can also say with the gross skill, well, we kind of get the opposite scenario. At lower levels of arousal, it's not as effective. And then performance peaks, excuse my dodgy old drawing, but performance peaks here at higher levels of arousal for that gross skill. Okay, so we can make the argument, look, performance quality is equivalent. It's meant to be the same. No, neither of these performers are necessarily performing better than one another. They just happen to be performing at their optimal point at a different level of arousal. And that's really the main point here, is that a coach, a performer, a trainer might want to look at the skill that's being done to try and decide or try and interpret what the best level of arousal is for that particular performer. I'd also say to you, you might want to interpret, let me change colour, you might want to interpret the fact that athletes also can have different personalities or experience of life. Would we say that kind of like an extrovert, like a very excitable person, they might be more like this yellow curve? So we could talk about personality. And another point I would make is about learner experience or performer experience. If we think about a real novice performer, someone's at the early stage of learning something, then we'd expect them to need to be calmer, wouldn't we, when they start to perform something? So we'd get something a bit more like this kind of turquoisey curve, but the curve, of course, would be lower, okay, somewhere around here, because they're not going to reach the same levels of performance quality. And then someone like a really experienced elite level autonomous stage learner, I nearly got my terms wrong, they maybe would be nearer this yellow curve. They might need that high levels of arousal, and they might have a big area of boredom that they need to get out of because they perform at that much higher level. That's all from me. Thanks for listening.